Welcome, dear viewers, to the Capital Clash News YouTube channel. What are the notable international news stories today? Let's take a look at the main news items below. On the 14th of this month, in a post on the Choose Seoul platform, President Donald Trump announced that many countries would send warships to cooperate with the U.S. in keeping the Hormuz Strait clear and safe. The U.S. president hopes that China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and other countries will send ships to the region so that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer a threat from a nation that has completely lost its power. On May 15, U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Gree said he was in talks with several countries mentioned by President Donald Trump. He said the U.S. expects China to be a constructive partner in efforts to restore navigation in the Hormuz Strait. However, to date, these countries have yet to make any specific commitments. Liu Bangyu, spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in the U.S., stated that all parties have a responsibility to ensure a stable and uninterrupted energy supply, and China will strengthen communication with relevant parties to promote de-escalation of tensions, but made no mention of military deployment as requested by Washington. In the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer refused to send warships despite facing pressure to resolve the domestic economic crisis. The British government is currently only considering deploying mine-detecting drones instead of sending aircraft carriers or destroyers to the conflict zone. Similarly, France emphasized that all escort missions would only be undertaken when conditions permitted and the fighting had subsided, while German Foreign Minister Johann Wedun expressed skepticism about the plan and stated that Germany would not become an active participant in the conflict. In contrast to the U.S. military approach, India preferred direct negotiations with Tehran to free the cargo ships. Speaking to the Financial Times, Indian Foreign Minister Janka said that discussions helped two Indian-flagged gas tankers pass safely through the strait on April 14. Mr. Janka emphasized that from India's perspective, coordination and finding solutions through dialogue would yield better results. On March 16, the Secretary General of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change began implementing the convention. Simon Stein argues that the Iran war was a bitter lesson about dependence on fossil fuels. According to Reuters, the head of the UN Climate Agency is expected to tell European Union policymakers that the disruption to energy markets caused by the war with Iran is a bitter lesson about the risks of reliance on fossil fuels. It also emphasized why governments need to gradually reduce their economy's dependence on oil and gas. Rear said that although geographically distant from the crisis in the Middle East, the EU is still feeling its impact through the surge in global energy prices. The price of fuel in Europe has increased by 50% during the joint US-Israel military campaign against Iran that began on May 28. Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, Simon Stein is expected to tell EU member state officials and ministers at an event in Bush that reliance on fossil fuels is eroding national security and sovereignty, instead leading to increasing dependence and costs. According to prepared remarks, Stein will say that Europe is more dependent on fossil fuel imports than almost any other major economy. In addition, he warned that reliance on fossil fuels is leaving consumers vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and price fluctuations. Rowe stated that the EU imports more than 90% of its oil and 80% of its natural gas. EU leaders are currently working urgently on drafting emergency measures to protect consumers from soaring energy prices. In terms of time frame, the European Commission (EC) stated that its climate change strategy, aimed at replacing fossil fuels with domestically produced renewable and nuclear energy, will help ensure energy security for countries and free them from the volatility of fuel prices. However, governments such as Italy and Hungary are urging Brussels to ease its efficiency policies to reduce short-term costs for industries. U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to launch a hot war against Iran appears to have gone awry just hours after he declared war. The U.S. government is currently in a dilemma, facing the risk of getting bogged down in other dangerous situations. After receiving intelligence that Iran's 86-year-old Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei met with high-ranking officials on the morning of October 28, the U.S. and Israel accelerated their attack plans, hoping to simultaneously eliminate all of Iran's top leadership.
If successful, U.S. officials estimate that the power vacuum created could be filled by a series of lower-level leaders who would hopefully be willing to usher in a more friendly era for the U.S. and Iran. The initial attacks and their targets across Iran were successful in assassinating Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei and other high-ranking officials. However, when initial reports emerged, it became clear they had created a new problem. All the candidates the U.S. administration had targeted for Iran's leadership had also been eliminated. President Trump acknowledged that most of the people we chose to go to have died, and now we have another group. According to reports, they may also have been killed. So I guess a third wave is coming. Before long, we won't recognize anyone anymore.
The far-reaching impact of the initial attack on the Iranian leadership marked the beginning of a series of gambles that transformed what white music had envisioned as a concentrated military operation, lasting a few weeks into an endless war escalating beyond American control, with increasingly far-reaching economic and political consequences and no clear exit strategy. Instead of collapsing as quickly as the U.S. and Israel had hoped, the Iranian regime consolidated its control and responded more forcefully than U.S. officials had anticipated. Attacks were launched across the Middle East, including oil tankers. Iran has effectively blocked the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, causing a global energy crisis that the U.S. administration is now struggling to contain. Nevertheless, Trump continued to tout the war as a resounding success, clinging to the sheer scale of the military campaign and suggesting that the U.S. could declare victory at any time. But after 2 weeks, Washington has yet to offer a concrete strategy to end the increasingly complex conflict, according to interviews with more than half a dozen people familiar with the internal discussions. To date, 13 American soldiers have been killed and approximately 140 others wounded since the conflict began. Across the United States, early opinion polls showed little sign of public support for the idea of war. This prompted U.S. officials to race to outline the next phases of the campaign. While aware of America's history of misguided adventures in the Middle East, they were unsure how to avoid a similar fate. This account of the first weeks of the Iran conflict is drawn from interviews around the world, including current and former U.S. officials, advisors and allies of President Trump, foreign officials, industry representatives, outside analysts, and others familiar with the internal discussions that shaped the opening phase of the conflict. In an interview, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt dismissed suggestions that Trump and his team were unprepared for any of the developments of the past few days. She asserted that the president had been fully informed of the risks involved and determined that it was still worthwhile to wage war against Iran. Ms. Leavitt said that Mr. Trump had been specifically warned that the most likely outcome after assassinating Grand Ayatollah Khamenei would be that he would be replaced by a similarly hardline leader. Although officials carried out the attacks in the hope that they would lead to a more benevolent figure coming to power within the Iranian regime, Leavitt, the press secretary, said that it was still a hope and a possibility, but the most likely outcome was presented to the president, and he knew this was that a tougher figure would be appointed by whatever remained of the regime. The article added that Trump was also informed of the possibility of widespread Iranian retaliation and that Iran might close the Strait of Hormuz. Trump was also advised that the Iranians might use any means necessary to maintain power. However, encouraged by previous military successes, Trump chose to proceed. There are factors that prompted President Trump to do so. During his first term, Trump himself ordered the assassination of Iran's highest-ranking military official at the time, Qasem Soleimani, and more recently, the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear sites last year. Those actions did not provoke much retaliation from Iran, thus reinforcing the belief among U.S. officials that the regime would likely not retaliate too strongly. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Israel have made steady progress in weakening the threat from Iranian proxy forces in the region, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. When a wave of protests erupted across the country last January, this further convinced them that Iranian leaders were in a weaker position than ever before. Trump was also bolstered by the bold arrest campaign a few weeks earlier, which ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and changed relations with the oil-rich nation overnight. Already frustrated by the slow pace of nuclear negotiations with Iran,
Trump became even more enthusiastic about the prospect of achieving another swift military victory. Senior officials in the Trump administration have discussed the potential consequences of igniting a conflict in the Middle East, warning the president repeatedly that they could be unpredictable and widespread. However, a senior U.S. official said that amid efforts to shrink Trump's inner circle to minimize the risk of information leaks, the war planning process was not as robust as usual. The White House has significantly reduced the size of the National Security Council over the past year, weakening its coordinating role in gathering input from across the government and ensuring that any critical concerns or considerations are not overlooked. Referring to the administration's internal processes, a senior U.S. official said the National Security Council used to be the final coordinating body before being referred to meetings of deputies or senior officials for approval. Without a truly interdisciplinary process led by the National Security Council, planning will fall apart. Ms. Levine rejected the notion that the National Security Council, or the U.S. war planning process, had been weakened. She pointed to the administration's past successful military campaigns as evidence. She said the president doesn't need layers of bureaucrats providing him with paperwork to make statements and decisions on foreign policy. This is a president who leads based on facts and intelligence provided by his senior team. As President Trump increasingly leaned toward attacks, those around him quickly followed his lead, embracing more optimistic predictions that Iran could be swiftly and decisively defeated, paving the way for a popular uprising. The revolutionary ideology has brought the regime to power. A government official said it was a shock and a tenfold astonishment. This is what those people started 47 years ago. So let's go deal with it. Looking back, some familiar with the discussions surrounding the war say those early days of exhilaration may mark the peak of the campaign so far. Although the military campaign was generally successful, it failed to meet the high expectations of Trump and his team that it would force the Iranian regime to surrender or spur a mass surrender of its fighting forces. Instead, Iranian leaders have become even more entrenched. Their regime quickly appointed a new hardline supreme leader. That was Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who in an early message vowed revenge. There are currently no signs of rebellion among the Iranian population. Since then, the Iranian government has repeatedly launched retaliatory attacks against various targets in the region, including neighboring Arab countries that did not participate in the attacks and were not prepared for the consequences. Although the current Iranian president initially apologized for attacks on neighboring countries, the attacks continued. Iran's new supreme leader has warned in a statement reportedly attributed to him that Gulf states should sever ties with the U.S. to avoid future attacks. The British government is reportedly considering deploying aerial mine-clearing UAVs to the Strait of Hormuz to help clear minefields in this vital shipping lane, with the aim of allowing the resumption of mine export flows. However, officials said that deploying warships as suggested by U.S. President Donald Trump could complicate the situation further. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is expected to announce a multi-million-pound support package for Britons affected by rising energy prices at a press conference at 10 Fallington on the 16th, where he will also emphasize the importance of de-escalating the crisis. Earlier on May 15th, British Energy Minister S. Miliband said it was very important that we reopen the Hawkwood Strait. There are many different ways we can contribute, including using UAVs to hunt naval mines. All of these options are being considered in conjunction with our allies. Any options that could help reopen the strait are being studied. Iran's announcement that it would target ships using this route, through which normally 20% of the world's oil supply passes, caused oil prices to surge from around $65 a barrel to over $100 a barrel. Economists predict inflation will rise and economic growth will slow this year, although the exact extent will depend on the duration of the conflict.